IB Biology, Ecology, Conservation, Option C, Part 6 is our first look at the conservation of species in ecosystems. Part 7 will also focus on conservation. The essential idea is entire communities need to be conserved in order to preserve biodiversity. Here is the outline of movies available for Ecology, Conservation, Option C. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused right here. From the Biodiversity Convention of 1992, biodiversity is defined as the variability amongst living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within a species, between species, and of ecosystems. Genetic diversity is the diversity of genes within a species. Species diversity, diversity of different species on Earth. Habitat diversity, diversity in all of the varying habitats on Earth. People have identified and cataloged approximately 2 million different species, but it is estimated that there might be 30 million, maybe more, up to 100 million. The diversity of species on Earth arises as a result of evolution through natural selection. Review the basics of natural selection: variation among individuals in a population, the overproduction of offspring, too many for the environment to support, limited resources, struggle among individuals to gain resources, and lastly, those best suited to gain resources survive and reproduce at higher rates than their neighbors. Terry Irwin, seen here in this photo, has done work where he fogs a forest, in this case an Amazonian forest, to determine an estimate for the Earth's number of different species. As he fogs the canopy, insects rain down into his nets, and most of the species are new to science. With each fogging, he uses the percentage new to science as a means to extrapolate to an estimated 30 million species on Earth. Over great spans of time, the diversity of living things on Earth has increased, even in the face of 5 great extinction events. This graph shows the number of species within families of plants going back hundreds of millions of years. You can see that diversity on Earth has generally increased. So while I defined diversity earlier in this movie, here is our first IB syllabus statement. State that species diversity in a community is a product of 2 variables: the number of different species, known as species richness, and their relative proportions, known as evenness. Examine the upper community and the lower community carefully. Consider which one of these communities is more diverse and why. So which of these 2 communities is more diverse? Explain your thinking with reference to the number of different species, richness, and relative proportions. I hope you can see that the upper community has 4 different species, while the lower community only has 3. Thus, the upper community would be considered more diverse. Easy, right? Keep your eyes open as I move to the next slide. In this slide, examine the upper community and the lower community carefully, and which one would be considered more diverse and why. Explain your thinking with reference to the number of different species, known as richness, and their relative proportions, known as evenness. You should notice that both locations have 4 species, so based on species number or species richness alone, they would have the same diversity. But we think of the top location to be of greater diversity because there is more balance among the 4 species. What do I mean by balance? I mean that the 4 species are more equally represented. The relative abundance of the 4 species is more even, more proportional. Thus, the top community is more diverse. So when we quantify diversity within a community, diversity is dependent on the number of different species, known as richness, and the relative proportions of the species, known as evenness. The Simpson's Diversity Index is the index we will use to assess local community diversity. The formula is given here when the collected data is presented as number of individuals counted for each of the existing species. The index takes into account both number of different species, richness, and the relative proportion of each species, evenness. Keep in mind that we will get a chance to practice using Simpson's index in class. This Simpson's diversity index formula is used when abundance data is collected as percent data. The index takes into account both number of different species, that's richness, and relative abundance of each species, that's evenness. So let's apply the Simpson's index. Here is the syllabus statement. Analyze the biodiversity of two local communities using Simpson's reciprocal index of diversity. In this table, you can see 4 communities with the potential for 5 different species, and on the right, calculated Simpson's diversity index values are given for each community. With the data, you can begin to explain relative biodiversity of each community on the basis of the number of different species or the relative abundance. So, for example, the diversity index for location 1 is 4, and this is lower than location 2, which is 5, simply because location 1 has only 4 species, whereas location 2 has 5 species. You can see the relative abundance of the species in each location is proportional, evenly distributed, so this is not a factor. Location 2 has the higher diversity than location 1 because of higher species richness. Now, location 3 is less diverse than location 2. Each location has 5 species, but the relative abundance of species in location 3 is not evenly distributed. 1 species is seen in relatively small numbers. Now, location 3 is more diverse than location 1 because location 3 has 5 species, while location 1 only has 4 species. And lastly, you can see that location 4 has a very low diversity index value. While location 4 does have 5 species, 1 species dominates with 50% of the habitat represented by species A. The asymmetry of the species abundance drives down the diversity index. Knowing the diversity of a system provides focus to conservation efforts. Numerical values of diversity are useful in understanding the nature of biological communities so that appropriate conservation can be implemented. Communities can be described and compared through the use of diversity indices, like Simpson's. Low diversity could be an indication of human impact, such as pollution, deforestation, or recent colonization of the site. Numerical values of diversity are useful in understanding the nature of biological communities so that appropriate conservation can be implemented. But the decisions that humans make about which communities require conservation are more complex. The desert is not as diverse as a rainforest, but it may have species that require protection, or humans may decide that the beauty of the desert, the aesthetics, would be a reason for protection. Communities can be described and compared through the use of diversity indices like Simpson's index. Low diversity could be an indication of human impact, such as pollution, deforestation, or recent colonization of the site. Simpson's diversity index can be used to assess human impact, but so could an indicator species. And that brings us to the next IB syllabus statement. State that an indicator species is an organism used to assess a specific environmental condition. The presence or absence of indicator species, such as pollinators or amphibians, indicates a general health of the system. Indicator species might be species with an important role in the system, like a pollinator or a keystone species, or it might be a species particularly sensitive to environmental change. This is true of amphibians. Otters are keystone species, and their presence would be an indication of a healthy ecosystem. Their presence maintains a balance and a system of high diversity. Without otters, urchins bloom, kelp becomes damaged, diversity declines. Otters are species whose presence indicates a healthy ecosystem. Certain species are found in highly polluted waters. These would be called indicator species. Tubifex worms are indicators of water with sewage. The stonefly larva and trout are indicator species. Their presence indicates clean water. This is a pollution tolerance index table that uses the relative numbers of different species to produce a pollution tolerance index value. The index value assesses the condition of the ecosystem. Many species in this group would generate high scores, and that would be indicative of clean water. While if the water has many species from either of these groups, the score would be low. This water would be polluted. So let's shift our attention to a last IB syllabus statement for this movie. Biogeographic factors affect species diversity. We will examine the effect of islandization and edge on diversity in the next movie, but here we will briefly look at the impact of location on diversity. We'll look at latitude, altitude, habitat diversity, size of the area, and even foliage height diversity. All of these are specific aspects of location that are important to influencing diversity. This image displays the diversity of birds by latitude. The diversity of birds is highest nearest to the equator. The pattern seen here for birds holds true for most all other types of organisms. Tropical rainforests are diverse for many reasons. They are highly productive due to the warm, wet conditions near to the equator. They have habitat diversity in the forest, river, and sometimes mountain. And there are vast tracts of undisturbed land. As well, tropical forests have remained undisturbed, unglaciated over very long periods of time. Mature forests, typical of tropical forests, represent late successional stages. Late successional stages, such as a mature forest, is more diverse. Climax forests, or forests with canopy and floor layers, have greater diversity because of the greater number of different niches, micro-ecozones, that support increased numbers of different species. There is a strong positive relationship between foliage height diversity and species diversity. Forests with very tall trees provide many niches, microhabitat diversity, thus greater species diversity. In equatorial forests, niches are many, canopy, substory, floor, and varied habitats, mountain with altitude and river. A region that displays change in altitude has increased diversity. The changes in altitude, with corresponding change in temperature and rainfall, increase the variety of habitats, from semi-tropical at the base to alpine at the summit. These varying habitats have greater numbers of niches that support greater diversity. Changes in temperature and rainfall due to changes in altitude result in dramatically different ecozones over very short distances: montane, subalpine, alpine. The varying ecozones support more niches that increase local diversity. The San Francisco peaks in Arizona have the desert ecozone in close proximity to the alpine ecozone due to altitude change. Altitude change results in ecozones, thus increased diversity. Mount Kilimanjaro is a 6,000-meter peak located on the equator. At the base, there's tropical forest, but at the top, there's an alpine ecozone. Over very short distances across northern India and into Nepal, varying ecozones exist due to altitude, from semi-arid to subtropical to alpine. The variety of ecozones due to altitude increase the biological diversity of the region. Over the last 12 slides, I've looked at biogeographic factors that affect species diversity specifically related to location, latitude, altitude, habitat diversity, size of the area, and foliage height diversity. In Part 7, we will analyze the impact of two biogeographic factors, and that would be island size and edge effects on diversity. All else being equal, latitude, altitude, human population density, disturbance, larger islands will have greater diversity. Larger parks, such as La Amistad, have less edge per area relative to a park such as Peninsula Osa. Thus, the larger park with less edge per area will have greater diversity. In other words, the edge per area ratio is smaller in larger parks relative to smaller parks. A smaller edge to area ratio results in less disturbance, thus greater diversity. I'll be following up on this concept in the next movie. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio, Ecology, Conservation, Option C, Part 6.